Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member Mfume, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity today to talk about bid protests and possible bid protest reform. The Competition and Contracting Act of 1984, or CICA, establishes that GAO is to provide for the inexpensive and expeditious resolution of protests. Consistent with this authority, GAO resolves more than 1,000 protests every year, all within 100 calendar days. However, over the last 10 years, the number of protests filed at GAO has steadily declined by 32%, and the number of protests filed at DoD has declined by an even greater proportion, by 48%. Notwithstanding that decline, the data from our annual bid protest reports reflects that the effectiveness rate, that is, the rate at which protesters receive some form of relief, either as a result of GAO sustaining a protest or an agency taking corrective action, has remained relatively stable at 50%. Recently, Section 885 of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025 included a provision for GAO to propose various possible reforms to the protest process, as well as to create benchmarks of the costs of bid protests. In this regard, while the benefits of the protest system in promoting accountability and integrity in federal procurements are important, those benefits must be balanced against the public's interest in allowing the government to efficiently acquire the goods and services necessary to discharge their obligations. Section 885 included 3 provisions. First, GAO was to consider enhanced pleading standards that protesters must meet before receiving access to administrative records of DoD procurements. Our regulations currently provide a robust pleading standard, and protests that do not meet this standard are dismissed, typically early in the process and prior to receiving access to agency records. While our current pleading standard allows us to dismiss legally insufficient protests early in the process, we propose to enhance our standard to make it clearer that protest allegations must be credible and supported by evidence. Second, Section 885 included a provision for GAO to develop benchmarks of the cost to DoD of resolving protests and the lost profits of the awardee during the pendency of a protest. However, during the preparation of our proposal, we found that sufficient data was unavailable concerning DoD's protest costs and lost profit rates to calculate reliable benchmarks. For example, DoD does not track or record the costs of bid protests because it is not statutorily required to do so. Additionally, DoD expressed the view that given the low number of protests of DoD procurements, the cost of tracking such data would outweigh the benefits. Third, Section 885 required GAO to propose a process for an unsuccessful protester to pay the government's protest-related costs and contract awardees' lost profits. Without sufficient data, however, it was not possible to create the benchmarks envisioned by Section 885. GAO remains neutral on creating a fee-shifting process. We believe that existing authorities are sufficient to efficiently resolve and limit the adverse impacts of protests filed without a substantial or legal factual basis. Consistent with the requirements of Section 885, however, we discussed 2 potential processes and practical and policy implications for congressional consideration. First, Congress might consider a focused statutory requirement for DoD to include a contract provision that would permit DoD to recoup or otherwise withhold profit or fee from where an incumbent contractor filed a protest that is dismissed as legally or factually insufficient. Second, Congress might consider authorizing GAO to require a protester to reimburse DoD for the costs incurred in handling the protest, as well as any lost profits incurred by the awardee whose contract was stayed during the pendency of a protest. The latter process would constitute a significant departure from GAO's current statutory authorities and would require significant structural changes to CICA and GAO's other statutory authorities. Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member Mfume, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions that you may have.